The rain came down like the sky itself was tearing apart. Lightning cracked across the black Yorkshire night, illuminating the towering stone walls of Ashford Hall as if the old mansion were on fire. Inside the grand ballroom, every candle flickered wildly, casting long, trembling shadows across the faces of the gathered nobility. And, in the center of it all stood Ronan Whittaker, the Duke of Ashford. His tall frame was rigid, the scar along his left jaw catching the light like a warning. Rainwater still clung to his dark hair from where he had ridden in only minutes earlier. His blue eyes, cold, unreadable, fixed on the young woman being dragged forward by two footmen. Elodie Marlowe. She was soaked to the bone. Her simple gray governess dress clung to her slender frame, dark hair plastered against her pale cheeks. Water dripped from her chin onto the polished marble floor. Yet, even now, trembling from cold and fear, her gray-green eyes burned with quiet defiance. Scarlett Beaumont stepped forward, her crimson gown glowing like fresh blood under the chandeliers. A cruel, triumphant smile curved her lips. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "I regret to be the one to tell you this, but your son's governess is nothing but a common thief, and worse." A shocked murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Scarlett lifted her chin. "Tonight, the Ashford sapphire, the priceless heirloom that has belonged to your family for 4 generations, vanished from your grandmother's private chamber. And I saw with my own eyes Miss Marlowe slipping out of that very room not 30 minutes ago." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the accusation sink in. "Moreover, I have reason to believe she's been carrying on a secret affair with some unknown gentleman. A man she meets under cover of darkness. A man who is clearly helping her sell your family's treasures." Elodie's breath hitched. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she did not look away from Ronan. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Only the relentless roar of rain against the tall windows could be heard. Genevieve Whittaker, the Dowager Duchess, sat upon her high-backed chair like a queen on a throne of ice. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, her black mourning dress severe. She said nothing, but her cold blue eyes never left Elodie. Ronan's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his scarred cheek. He took one slow step forward, his boots echoing heavily on the marble. "Miss Marlowe," he said, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of winter wind. "Do you deny these charges?" Elodie lifted her chin. Rainwater still streamed down her face, but her voice, though quiet, was steady. "I have stolen nothing, your Grace, and I have no secret lover." Scarlett let out a soft, mocking laugh. Of course she would say that. Ronan's gaze remained locked on Elodie. For one brief second, something flickered behind his icy eyes. Doubt, pain, something almost human. Then the mask slammed back into place. He turned to the 2 footmen still gripping Elodie's arms. "Take her." Elodie's eyes widened slightly, the only crack in her composure. The footmen began dragging her toward the side doors. Her wet shoes slipped on the marble. She stumbled once, but quickly regained her footing, refusing to fall. As they reached the doorway, a violent crack of thunder shook the entire hall. Lightning flashed again, illuminating Elodie's face one final time as the heavy iron manacles were snapped around her wrists. She looked back over her shoulder, straight at Ronan. In that single heartbeat, Ronan Whittaker felt something inside his chest twist violently. He had given the order. He had condemned her. And yet the look in her eyes wasn't hatred. It was quiet, devastating disappointment, mixed with a strange, aching resignation, as if she had expected nothing less from the world. The doors slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Ronan stood motionless in the center of the ballroom, rain still dripping from his coat onto the floor. His grandmother's voice cut through the stunned silence, sharp and satisfied. "Well done, grandson. We cannot allow such filth to remain under our roof, especially not near dear little Juniper. At the mention of his younger sister's name, Ronan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could still see Elodie's face, still hear the quiet steadiness in her voice when she denied the charges, still feel the way her eyes had pierced straight through the armor he had worn for years. Outside, the storm howled louder, as if the night itself was furious at what had just occurred. And deep in his chest, a small, dangerous voice whispered, "What if Scarlett Beaumont was lying? What if the woman he had just ordered chained and locked away was innocent?" Ronan Whittaker, the feared Duke of Ashford, the man who had survived war and loss and betrayal, suddenly realized one terrifying truth. He may have just made the worst mistake of his life. This is only the beginning. A story of devastating injustice, of buried family secrets, and of a love powerful enough to force even the coldest duke to question everything he once believed. Because sometimes the greatest storms do not rage outside our windows. They begin the moment we choose to look away from the truth. The heavy oak door of the small attic room clicked shut behind Elodie, with a sound far too final for such a simple lock. She stood motionless in the center of the dim space wrists, still raw from the manacles they had removed only minutes ago. Rain continued to lash against the single narrow window high above her head. Each drop sounded like tiny accusations. Elodie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent shivering that had nothing to do with the cold. She had expected cruelty from Scarlett Beaumont. She had even expected suspicion from the Dowager Duchess. But the look in Ronan Whittaker's eyes when he gave the order, that cold, decisive command, it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. A soft knock broke the silence. The door creaked open just enough for a slender figure to slip inside. Juniper Whittaker. The young girl's dark curls were slightly disheveled, her nightgown hastily covered by a deep blue dressing robe. She closed the door quickly and pressed her back against it, breathing fast. "Miss Marlowe?" Juniper whispered, her voice trembling with urgency. "I only have a few minutes. They think I'm already asleep." Elodie turned slowly. Even in the weak candlelight, Juniper could see the exhaustion and quiet pain etched across the governess's face. "You shouldn't be here," Lady Juniper, Elodie said softly. "If they catch you, I don't care." Juniper stepped closer, her eyes wide with determination and something else. Recognition. "I heard everything tonight. Scarlett's lies, my brother's order. But I know you. I mean, I really know you." Elodie frowned, slightly confused. Juniper reached out and gently touched Elodie's cold hand. 10 years ago, my father spoke of a family that was destroyed overnight. The Marlowes of Willowmere. Their daughter was only a child then, but I remember the name, Elodie Marlowe. Elodie's breath caught. For the first time since the accusation, her carefully guarded mask cracked. "You..." Remember, Juniper nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was only 9, but I remember my father saying it was the greatest injustice he had ever witnessed. Your family lost everything in one night because of some terrible scandal. And now, you're here? As my governess? As if fate brought you back to Ashford Hall?" Elodie looked away, staring at the rain-streaked window. "I didn't come here seeking revenge," she whispered. "I came because I needed work. Because after my parents died, there was nothing left. No home, no name worth protecting." Her voice grew quieter, but no weaker. "I lost them both within 6 months. My father, broken by debts he never created. My mother, she simply stopped fighting. I was 17, alone. And now..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Downstairs in the dimly lit study lined with ancient books and darker secrets, Ronan Whittaker paced like a caged wolf. The fire crackled low in the hearth, but it did nothing to warm the ice settling in his chest. He had just returned from the vault. The Ashford sapphire, the very piece Scarlet claimed had been stolen, was not missing at all. It was there, lying innocently in its velvet case, except the clasp had been deliberately loosened, as if someone wanted it to look stolen. Ronan's fingers tightened around the small blue stone until the edges bit into his palm. Scarlet Beaumont. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had trusted her words too quickly, had let his grandmother's expectations cloud his judgment, and he had condemned an innocent woman. A soft knock sounded at the study door. Mrs. Agatha Thorne, the elderly housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Whitakers, entered carrying a tray of brandy. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. "Your Grace?" She began, her voice hoarse with age and hesitation. "If I may speak plainly, just this once." Ronan turned surprised. Mrs. Thorne had always been quiet, almost invisible in her loyalty. "Speak." The old woman took a shaky breath. "That girl upstairs, Miss Marlowe. She is not the first Marlowe to suffer under this roof. 10 years ago, it was her father who was accused of forgery and theft. The charges were never properly proven. But the Dowager..." Mrs. Thorne's eyes flicked toward the door, as if afraid Genevieve might appear. She pushed hard for his ruin, said it was necessary to protect the family's honor. Ronan felt the ground shift beneath him. "My grandmother?" New Mrs. Thorne nodded slowly. She knew enough. "And tonight, I fear history is repeating itself." Ronan's hand slammed down on the desk, making the brandy glass jump. He turned away, staring into the dying fire. Images flashed through his mind, Elodie's soaked figure, being dragged away, the quiet strength in her eyes, even as chains closed around her wrists, the way she had looked at him. Not with hatred, but with a deep, weary disappointment. He had become the very thing he once despised, a man who chose family duty over justice. Up in the attic room, Juniper was still holding Elodie's hand. "You don't have to tell me everything tonight," the young girl whispered. "But please don't give up. My brother, he's not as cold as he seems. He's been broken by war, by our father's death, by expectations that would crush anyone. But I saw his face when they took you away. He was torn." Elodie gave a small, sad smile. "Even if he doubts Scarlet's story now, what can he do? I am still the daughter of a ruined man. Still the governess accused of theft. The world will always believe the powerful before the powerless." Juniper shook her head fiercely. "Not if we find the truth." Below them, Ronan stood alone in his study, the weight of his grandmother's possible betrayal pressing down on his shoulders like lead. He poured the brandy, but didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the flames and whispered into the silence, "What have I done?" And somewhere in the depths of Ashford Hall, the first fragile threads of buried secrets began to unravel. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably. The next 3 days passed under a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on every corridor of Ashford Hall. Ronan Whitaker moved like a shadow through his own home. He spoke little, ate less, and trusted no one completely, not even himself. In the dead of night, he slipped out of the manor on a black stallion and rode hard to the neighboring estate of Lord Edmund Harrington. The 2 men had fought side by side in the war. They had carried each other's broken bodies off blood-soaked fields. That bond was the only thing Ronan still believed in. In the quiet glow of Edmund's private library, Ronan laid everything bare. "The sapphire was never stolen," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "It was planted. But Scarlet has witnesses, letters, even a damn handkerchief with Elodie's initials. I need proof, Edmund. Real proof, before this goes any further." Lord Edmund Harrington studied his old friend for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you. But Ronan, be careful. Once you start digging up old graves, sometimes the dead reach back. 2 days later, they found him, Captain Elias Drummond, Ronan's former comrade in arms, now living quietly on a small farm near the moors. The man looked older than his years, his shoulders hunched as if still carrying the weight of every fallen soldier. When Ronan told him why he had come, Elias's face tightened with visible conflict. "I owe you my life." "Whitaker," Elias said quietly, staring into the fire. "But some truths, they destroy more than they heal. Scarlett Beaumont's family paid me once to look the other way, 10 years ago, during the Marlowe scandal. I was young, scared. I took the money." He paused, hands trembling slightly around his cup. "I still have the letters, the real ones, not the ones she's waving around now." Ronan's heart pounded heavily in his chest. "Then give them to me." Elias looked up, eyes haunted. "If I do this, I burn every bridge I have left with the old families. Are you prepared to stand by the girl?" No matter what the ton says, Ronan didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was, he no longer knew what he was prepared to do. Meanwhile, high in the attic rooms, Elodie Marlowe refused to break. Even under house arrest, with a guard posted outside her door, she continued teaching Juniper Whitaker every afternoon. The lessons had changed. They were no longer about French verbs or piano scales. They were about courage. Fear is not weakness. Lady Juniper Elodie said one gray afternoon, her voice calm despite the dark circles under her eyes. "It is only proof that you still have something worth fighting for. The moment you stop feeling afraid, that is when you have truly lost." Juniper sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, listening with wide, adoring eyes. "You're not afraid they'll send you away forever?" Elodie smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm terrified. But I will not let that terror make me small. Not again." That same night, the storm returned. Scarlett Beaumont arrived at Ashford Hall, unannounced, soaked and triumphant, carrying a sealed packet of new evidence. Forged letters, a witness statement claiming Elodie had been seen meeting a mysterious man at midnight. Even a torn piece of lace from Elodie's nightgown supposedly found in the stables. Ronan stood in the drawing room staring at the documents spread across the mahogany table. For one terrible moment, he almost believed them. The handwriting looked real. The details were too precise to be invented. Doubt crawled through his veins like poison. Until he noticed one small thing. The ink on the newest letter was still slightly wet. Scarlett had made her move too quickly. Ronan's hands clenched until his knuckles turned white. He dismissed everyone from the room, including Scarlett, who left with a satisfied smirk. Then he did something he had never done before. He walked upstairs and stopped outside Elodie's locked door. The guard stepped aside without a word. Ronan pressed his forehead against the heavy wood, listening. From inside came the softest sound, a broken, muffled sob. Elodie was crying. Not loud theatrical tears meant to be heard, but quiet, shuddering cries of a woman who had held herself together for too long and was finally alone with her pain. Ronan closed his eyes. Something inside his chest cracked wide open. He remembered the war, the nights he had cried silently in the mud so his men wouldn't hear. He remembered the day his father died while he was still overseas. He remembered every time he had chosen duty over feeling. And now, this woman he had barely spoken to was tearing down every wall he had built. The fire of truth was burning. It was burning away the false honor of his family name. It was burning through the cold armor he had worn since returning from the battlefield. It was burning straight into his heart. Ronan stayed there for a long time, listening to her quiet tears, feeling his own chest tighten with emotions he had long forgotten how to name. When the crying finally stopped, he whispered against the door so softly no one else could hear. "I'm sorry, Elodie." Then he turned and walked away, the weight of his growing feelings heavier than any scar he carried from war. The flames of truth had been lit, and they would not be easily extinguished. The clock in the main hall had just struck midnight when Ronan Whitaker made his decision. He could no longer wait. With quiet, determined steps, he walked through the dimly lit corridors of Ashford Hall until he reached the old housekeeper's modest quarters at the far end of the east wing. Mrs. Agatha Thorne opened the door after his second knock. She was already in her nightgown, a shawl pulled tightly around her frail shoulders. When she saw the look in the Duke's eyes, her face paled. "Your Grace, it is very late." "I know," Ronan said, his voice low and strained. "But I cannot carry these questions anymore. You know the truth, Mrs. Thorne. You have known it for years. Tell me, all of it." The old woman hesitated for a long moment, fear and loyalty warring across her wrinkled face. Then her shoulders sagged, as if the weight she'd carried for a decade had finally become too heavy. She stepped aside and let him in. From the bottom drawer of her worn wooden dresser, she pulled out a small yellowed envelope sealed with faded wax. "This was never meant to see daylight," she whispered. "Her Grace, your grandmother, ordered me to burn it 10 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to do it." Ronan took the letter with hands that were not quite steady. As he read the elegant but damning handwriting, the room seemed to tilt. It was a private correspondence between Genevieve Whitaker and the Beaumont family. A cold, calculated agreement. In exchange for certain lands and financial favors, the Beaumonts would spread rumors and forge documents that would destroy the Marlowe family overnight. The goal was simple: to seize their valuable northern estates. Elodie's father had been innocent, and Genevieve had known it. Ronan's breath came sharp and shallow. The paper trembled in his grip. Before he could speak, a heavy knock sounded at the front door of the manor. Lord Edmund Harrington had arrived, and he was not alone. Captain Elias Drummond stepped into the entrance hall, his face grim, clutching an old leather-bound journal against his chest. "I came as soon as I received your message," Elias said quietly. "These pages, they contain every detail of the transaction Scarlett forced me to witness. Dates, amounts, even her signature. She threatened my family if I ever spoke." The three men stood in heavy silence as the full picture finally emerged. Ronan felt a storm rising inside him, rage, grief, and a deep, aching shame. He turned without another word and strode toward his grandmother's private sitting room. Genevieve Whitaker was still awake, sitting by the dying fire, her cane resting against her chair. When Ronan entered and closed the door behind him, she looked up, her sharp blue eyes narrowing at the expression on his face. "You know," she said simply. It was not a question. Ronan placed the old letter and Elias's journal on the small table in front of her. "Yes," he replied, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "I know what you did to the Marlowes, what you allowed Scarlett Beaumont to do. And I know you were prepared to let an innocent woman rot in disgrace. Again, to protect the precious Whitaker name." Genevieve's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time in years, her iron composure cracked. "I did what I believed was necessary," she said, her voice thinner than usual. "The family's honor." Honor. Ronan's voice rose cracking with pain. "This is not honor, grandmother. This is fear dressed up as duty. You destroyed an entire family to gain land and influence. And tonight, you nearly destroyed Elodie the same way." He stepped closer, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. Then slowly, painfully, Ronan Whitaker, the feared Duke of Ashford, lowered himself to one knee in front of his grandmother. "I have spent years believing that protecting this family meant never showing weakness," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "But real honor is not in hiding our sins. It is in having the courage to face them, to make them right." Genevieve stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes for the first time he could remember. In the hallway, just outside the slightly ajar door, Juniper Whittaker stood with Elodie. The young girl had risked everything to bring Elodie here in secret, her small hand gripping the governess's tightly. Elodie watched the scene unfold with wide, glistening eyes. Her heart pounded so loudly, she feared it might be heard. When Ronan spoke those final words, choosing justice over blind loyalty, something inside her chest shifted. Hope, fragile and trembling, began to bloom where only despair had lived. Ronan rose slowly to his feet. Tomorrow, he said to his grandmother, we will set this right. Publicly. No more lies. No more silence. He turned toward the door and paused as if sensing Elodie's presence. Their eyes met through the narrow opening. For one long, breathless moment, the air between them felt charged with everything unsaid, pain, regret, and the first fragile sparks of something deeper, something dangerously close to love. The wind outside began to rise. It whistled through the ancient trees surrounding Ashford Hall, carrying away the heavy stillness that had lingered for so long. It was as if the night itself had decided it was time. The winds of justice had finally begun to blow, sweeping aside the ashes of the past and clearing the way for a new dawn. The final ball of the season arrived like a quiet promise of redemption. Ashford Hall glowed with hundreds of candles. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the crowded ballroom, casting golden light across silk gowns and polished uniforms. Genevieve Whittaker had insisted on hosting this night herself to set things right, she had said with a trembling voice no one had ever heard from her before. The air was thick with anticipation and whispered curiosity. Ronan Whittaker stood at the top of the grand staircase. His broad shoulders straight the scar on his jaw, catching the light like a silent reminder of every battle he had fought, both on the fields of war and within his own heart. Beside him, Elodie Marlowe waited in a simple yet elegant gown of soft ivory. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she held her head high. She had not asked for this moment. She had never asked for any of it. Ronan offered her his arm. When they descended the stairs together, the entire ballroom fell into a stunned hush. At the center of the floor, Ronan gently released her arm and stepped forward alone. His deep voice carried across the silent hall, steady but laced with raw emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I stand before you, not as the Duke of Ashford, but as a man who must answer for his mistakes. He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the gathered nobility. 3 weeks ago, I allowed a terrible injustice to take place under my own roof. I accused an innocent woman, Miss Elodie Marlowe, of theft and dishonor. I ordered her chained and locked away based on lies. Tonight, I publicly withdraw every false charge. I offer her my deepest apology. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. Scarlett Beaumont, standing near the refreshment table in a striking crimson gown, went deathly pale. Her fan slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Before she could speak, Captain Elias Drummond stepped forward, his posture rigid with long-held regret. I was there 10 years ago, he said clearly. I witnessed the Beaumont family forge documents and spread lies that destroyed the Marlowe name. Scarlett Beaumont personally pressured me to stay silent. I have the proof. Lord Edmund Harrington followed, holding up the old letters and journal. The evidence is undeniable. The Marlowe family was ruined by deliberate deceit for land and power. The ballroom erupted in gasps and frantic whispers. Scarlett's eyes darted wildly. For the first time, her perfect mask shattered completely. She looked small, terrified. Then Genevieve Whittaker rose slowly from her chair, leaning heavily on her cane. Her voice, though frail with age, rang with quiet authority. I, too, carry shame this night. She said each word heavy with effort. I knew the truth, and I chose silence to protect what I believed was our family's honor. That was my sin. Today I return the lands that were wrongly taken from the Marlowes. They belonged to Miss Elodie Marlowe, as they always should have. Tears shimmered in the old woman's eyes as she looked directly at Elodie. I am sorry, child. Truly. The weight of those words seemed to shift the very air in the room. Ronan turned to Elodie. The music had stopped. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed upon them. He walked to her slowly, then did something no one expected. He lowered himself to one knee right there in the center of the dance floor. The candlelight caught the vulnerability in his usually cold blue eyes. Elodie, he said, his voice rough with feeling, I have spent years hiding behind duty and pride. I have hurt you terribly. But in these painful weeks, you have shown me what real courage looks like. You taught me that truth matters more than any title, more than any name. He reached out and gently took her trembling hand. I am not asking you to be my duchess tonight. I am not asking for ceremony or obligation. I am asking, as a man who has finally learned how to love honestly. His voice dropped to a tender whisper that still carried to every corner of the hall. Will you allow me to stand beside you? Not as your protector, but as a man who loves the truth in you. More than any fortune or reputation, Elodie's eyes filled with tears. They spilled down her cheeks, but her lips curved into the most radiant, heartfelt smile. For a moment, she could not speak. Then softly, clearly, she answered, Yes, Ronan. With all my heart, yes. A wave of applause erupted warm and genuine, filling the ballroom like sunlight after endless rain. Later that night, long after the guests had departed, the storm that had raged for weeks finally passed. The sky over Yorkshire cleared, revealing a canopy of brilliant stars. Ronan, Elodie Juniper, and even Genevieve Whittaker stood together on the wide stone terrace. The air smelled fresh and clean, washed by rain. Genevieve looked smaller now, leaning on her cane, but there was a quiet peace in her eyes that had never been there before. Juniper slipped her hand into Elodie's, smiling through happy tears. Ronan stood close to Elodie, his arm gently around her waist. He looked up at the vast, peaceful sky, and then down at the woman beside him. In that moment, he understood. Justice had come late, but it had come. It had not only restored what was stolen, it had healed broken hearts. It had taught a proud duke how to kneel. It had turned fear into courage, and shame into love. Under the quiet Yorkshire stars, the Whittaker family stood together, no longer divided by secrets, but bound by truth and forgiveness. And in the gentle night breeze, it felt as though the past had finally been allowed to rest. This is a story that reminds us, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to face our mistakes, to speak the truth, and to love honestly, even when it costs us everything we once held dear. Because only then can we truly find our way home. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully only to support production while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.